Okay, cool. So, I mean, just to start this off, and just so I can check the sound levels again, if you just give me your name and your role, profession.
All right. Okay, I'm Kenny Brophy. I'm a senior lecturer in archaeology at the University of Glasgow.
If you could just give like a brief background to your work. I know that you've written about, is it curses monuments?
Yeah, yeah. So my background is a kind of traditional prehistorian, looking at the Neolithic period, which is the first part of the Stone Age where people farmed. And so in Scotland, that's between 4,000 and 2,500 BC. So for the last 25 years, I've been studying various elements of that, especially ceremonial enclosures, settlement sites, and just general aspects of everyday life in the Neolithic. So the main bit of research that I've done with that is looking at cursus monuments, which are monuments of the 4th millennium BC, which are enormous rectangular enclosures. I did my PhD on them back in the mid-90s, and then I finished a book on it a couple of years ago, and they're sites that are really interesting because they're some of the biggest and earliest monumental structures we have in Britain. So it's the first time where people are really starting to kind of reshape the landscape in a big way, either through cutting down massive amounts of trees or through creating enormous earthwork enclosures. So they're sites that are really important, and they seem to have originated in Scotland as a concept, and then ended up down around Stonehenge and Dorset, where there's cursus monuments that are up to 10 kilometres long. The ones in Scotland are a bit more modest. So that was part of a kind of quite a traditional study, in a sense, that was trying to say something about a set of archaeological evidence, which would help us understand what was happening in Scotland 5,000-6,000 years ago. So that kind of aspect as a prehistorian is what I've done throughout my career.
And it's quite interesting you say it's the first sort of evidence of them, like Neolithic age, really sort of changing landscape. I want to maybe come to that later on, but where did the name curses come from?
The term cursus is quite an obscure origin. It was William Stukeley, who was an antiquarian who was operating in the 18th century, and he found a large cursus down in the south of England as an earthwork. Most of them don't survive as earthworks, and he assumed, because of its scale, that it was, and its long rectangular form, that it was a chariot racing track, and it was Roman. So it's a derivation of cursus or circus. So it comes from that. So the idea is that it was some kind of chariot racing routeway, and the name and the label was then applied to similar sites that were found around the south of England, and then it just stuck. So they're still called cursus monuments, but they're not Roman, they're not circuses, they're not chariot racing tracks. They have nothing to do with that. But the name is just stuck. So it's a bit of a weird aberration that goes back to the early 18th century.
That's quite interesting. Is that it's quite funny that they just assumed that something Roman would have translated to another culture, everything historical would be.
And they did, because they didn't have a clue how old anything was, and they didn't have any frame of reference. They'd no radiocarbon dating back in the 18th century. They couldn't really see anything older than Roman. They couldn't understand older than Roman stuff. So everything was either Roman or Druid, and those two opposing kind of forces. So they were they basically, everything they found they had to try and fit within their conceptual framework. And their framework at that time was, if it's big, if it's impressive, if it looks like it took a bit of sophistication to construct, it's probably Roman. And if it's shambolic and chaotic and a bit disorganised, then it was probably the local Druids that did it. So that was the way they viewed things. So it's a kind of, that was their worldview. That was all they knew, really, in terms of how old the past was, because back then they thought the world was created in 4004 BC, and there was all those kind of, so it was a completely different contextual framework they had for everything.
Maybe it's good to get straight into the sort of psychogeography of your approach to archaeology, and talk about deep time. I mean, I know that deep time has sort of geological meaning, doesn't it?
Yeah,
as well?
yeah.
But how do you sort of use that within the?
For me, it refers to places that have got a very long-term history or prehistory of human use and occupation, or significance as well. It doesn't necessarily mean continuity or that, you know, a place has been used for thousands of years continuously. But what it does mean is that certain places are returned to again and again for various reasons. So cursus monuments, in a sense, were a way into that, because the way that I approached cursus monuments was to visit the sites in the landscape and then to walk along them, because they're big, long, rectangular structures, which is a technique that was developed by an archaeologist called Chris Tilley in the 1990s, which he called phenomenology, drawing on a philosophical concept. So my idea was to walk along the cursus monuments and try and help get an insight into the mind of a Neolithic person who built the monument. And at the time that was fine, and I did all that stuff and I got some vaguely interesting results. But actually, as time went on and I reflected on it, I started to think that actually, what am I really doing here? What I'm doing is I'm walking through a modern field surrounded by telegraph poles, there's roads, I can hear cars, there's planes flying overhead, there's cows in the field next door. There's all these kind of modern accoutrements in the landscape, and I'm somehow trying to imagine that I'm in 3000 BC and that none of that stuff's there, which is what Tilley was advocating. And then I started to realise actually that what I'm doing is really is describing my experience of a prehistoric site in a modern landscape, and that perhaps that's as good as it gets. Maybe I can't actually see beyond the modern landscape, and I have to accept that my engagements as an archaeologist are happening now in the present landscape, and that rather than try and ignore that and pretend that's not happening, I should maybe explore that idea and see where it takes me. So then I started to think about, well, if we're thinking about methodologies that involve following ancient routeways, or old layouts and grids and plans of places, and you try and follow those within a contemporary setting, then the obvious methodological or intellectual framework for that is psychogeography, where you're thinking about, you know, almost a kind of an emotional attachment to the way things were before they became urbanised, which is usually how it's viewed, and the imposition of urban grids on older townscapes. And so by applying that to prehistory, you can think about how an ancient routeway that's in this case is 5,000 or 6,000 years old works within a modern grid-like agricultural landscape. And in some cases, the cursus monuments are covered by urban areas as well, so that allows that to work even better. So that's where I started to think about psychogeography. I was trying to think about how to deal with these ancient places that had represented these kind of deep human engagements with place, but within thoroughly modern and urban and modern agricultural places. And it's that juxtaposition is really exciting for me as an archaeologist. But most archaeologists will try and wish that away. We'll try and ignore that. We'll try and say, well, okay, you know, there's a road there, there's a car going past, but forget all that, because, you know, we're thinking about the Neolithic, we're thinking about the Bronze Age. But actually, the more I focus on these kind of engagements, the more I think that actually we should be thinking about how those engagements are happening now, and how the archaeology is appearing to us as archaeologists or anyone else who engages with this stuff. So it's about, so deep time is important for me as a concept, because it's about trying to get your head around the fact that you're standing in a place that is now a road intersection or an industrial estate or a field with a modern cash crop in it, and you're actually in a place that 3,000, 4,000 or 5,000 years ago was used as a ceremonial site, as a burial location, as a settlement, or as something else. So it allows me to try and make sense of those engagements, because otherwise they don't make any sense, I don't think.
It's interesting you say other archaeologists might consider it. Do you think they sort of is that how they transport themselves back? They sort of LARP themselves into history. Yeah, well, they don't dress up, but apart from that, I mean, they do everything else. Dress up in their minds, maybe.
Well, they do, yeah, because Tilley said, you know, what I'm doing is imaginative self-transportation, he said, which is a made-up concept that he made up and no one else has ever used that concept, which essentially means that I am imagining I am in the footsteps of a Neolithic person walking through the landscape. I can see something on the horizon. Would have that been significant for a Neolithic person seeing that, and all these arrangements and all these kind of different relationships, usually visual or bodily engagements with the landscape. So most archaeologists are trying to understand the past in a really literal sense. They're trying to make sense of what was happening whenever 10 years ago or 500 years ago or 5,000 years ago using archaeological techniques, and so therefore the contemporary setting is just something that's not relevant to the way they view the past, because what they're trying to get to is what was happening before. So so an element of that is imagining yourself in the past and how it might have been to see these things in the past, or essentially imagining yourself to be an objective scientist who's gathering data that will somehow reveal a truth about the past, which is actually a myth.
I mean, I took some quotes down from your blog. One of them here is that prehistory is gone, it's over, done with. A less prehistoric a place or a landscape feels more likely that prehistoric remains in that context will tell us something meaningful about our engagements with the past and the present and the conditions within the archaeological knowledge emerges. And also the way you talk about how the present is subordinated by the past in the present, which is really just the present when you stop and think about it, which I quite like.
Yeah. Well, it's semantics, I guess, in a sense, because it's self-evident that the past has always just happened a few seconds ago, and it's also self-evident the past is gone, unless you believe in some kind of multiverse or some kind of parallel universe type physics, which is beyond archaeological minds. So for me, the past has gone, and therefore, as archaeologists, we have to accept the fact that whatever we say about the past is going to be, to an extent, speculative. You can dress it up in any way you want. It can be an informed interpretation or a theory or a hypothesis or a model, or it can be a kind of a semi-fictional account, or it can be educated guesswork. It depends on your perspective and how much evidence base you have for anything you say about the past. So everything we say as archaeologists is inherently interpretive, and is therefore also inherently a subjective opinion, and is not necessarily what happened in the past. And again, as archaeologists, it's sometimes quite difficult to for some archaeologists to accept the fact that not only prehistory is a good example. For prehistory, nothing is really provable except at a very kind of technical scientific level. Like people grew wheat, or people had cows. That those kind of things are provable. But beyond that, what people did with cows, how people moved cows around the landscape, did they have names for their cows, all that kind of stuff, we don't, none of that stuff we know. All of it's just interpretation. So almost everything we say as archaeologists has to be couched in kind of terms of, well, this is maybe how it was, this is possibly how it was. So therefore, as a discipline, we had tried to develop over the years different thought processes and intellectual processes that try and almost ignore that or go into denial about that, about the unknowability of the past. But once you start to move beyond that and you start to think, well, okay, the past's unknowable, but that's actually liberating. When you actually start to think, well, okay, but how did that frees up the mind to actually say, right, okay, within the bounds of evidential constraints, we can say really interesting things about the past without necessarily feeling tethered to everything being factually backed up with some kind of bit of science or some kind of measurement or some kind of object that's been found in a hole in the ground. So it's about trying to create these kind of, they're essentially fictional accounts. I mean, in the same way as you read a novel that's set in a fictional past, like there's loads of steampunk novels just now which have got stuff which is completely made up, but then they've also got Queen Victoria doing this, that and the other. There's research has been shown that on a certain day it was raining, or on a certain day this was the train timetable. So there's a kind of mixture, a blending of factual information and then fiction, like dialogue and stuff connecting it all. And archaeology is like that. It's essentially a kind of a kind of a historical type of fiction or a prehistorical type of fiction. So therefore, for me that's liberating. But for other archaeologists that's problematic, and you would much rather view it as being kind of a process of hypothesis testing, and creating models that can be measured and bashed about, and then you can decide if it works or not. So it depends on your perspective as an archaeologist. I can't remember where the question started now, but that's
no, it's good. It's interesting you naturally went onto the idea of fiction, because that was another point that I wanted to talk about. You see, you draw a very firm line between two types of archaeological narratives. The ones that you write are indeed fictionalised, and others that are far from fictional, serious. They're your actual experiences of the site, of the place. And I wanted to talk about like fiction and now, in relevance to now, when we live in a post-truth era sort of thing, and the rules of fact have somewhat changed, politically, culturally, maybe. And I guess as you're saying, like as an archaeologist and a historian, like interpretation is very much key to
yeah
a lot of the stories that you tell. So
Yes.
I mean, I'm just wondering how you feel about that.
Yeah, and that's a problematic side of the argument that this is all liberating and exciting, because we're essentially educated fiction writers about the past, because then there comes with that a responsibility, and there comes with that there still has to be checks and balances, and this is where again archaeologists have been wrestling for a few decades now with this idea of acknowledging the kind of the reality of the nature of our archaeological narratives about the past, but also trying to find ways to ensure that this doesn't lead to problematic narratives which are viewed as being unethical, immoral, lies, misleading, politically motivated. That's why the disciplinary structure is important. It's why we are archaeologists, because if it was just an anything goes kind of situation where anyone could say anything they wanted about the past without any kind of bounds, then that would fit in with this kind of chaotic post-truth world that we're moving into. So archaeologists, in a sense, have a responsibility to set the rules of engagement for what is acceptable and what's not. And so there's very clear things that most archaeologists will say, well, that's something that is an interpretation too far. Like the Creation Museum in America, where they've got they have researchers working there and academics who are trying to prove that that the world was created by God and intelligent design and all that kind of stuff. So most archaeologists would dismiss that for a whole range of different reasons, whether for personal religious beliefs or just by the fact that we know from most of the evidence out there that idea is nonsensical. So there has to be a way that we can challenge these kind of ideas. There has to be we can challenge ridiculous media reports about the past and about prehistory, or about things about Stonehenge that we know are not tenable. So the post-truth environment means that archaeologists have to be, in a sense, much more aware of the potential dangers of letting the genie out of the bottle too much in terms of the way we view the past. So I think that, but I think that a really important part of that is that we have to be honest about the nature of what we do as archaeologists, which is why I kind of muse about these things in my blog, and because I think that we have to understand the nature of what we do as archaeologists, and then we can start to challenge other narratives that are maybe more problematic. So we have to still be able to look at a story that pops up in a website and actually say, look, this is ridiculous. This is for a whole range of reasons. This is wrong. This is unacceptable. It can't be an anything goes kind of culture. So there's a balance where on one hand we are these educated fiction writers, but then we also have to. It's important that we remember that it can't just be the fiction side of things. It has to be the factual underpinning of some kind, or an ethical and moral underpinning. So it's quite a challenging environment, because it's really difficult to keep control of media stories, and there's lots of good examples in the last few years of media stories about archaeology that are just nonsense. But yet they get picked up by mainstream media in the same way as other stories do, and if no one challenges those narratives, then they become quite ingrained. So I think that every other discipline has got similar issues. I think that I'm sure every day there's stories about physics and about chemistry and issues to do with health and all sorts of other things which are equally nonsensical, which need to be challenged by academics.
So you're essentially sort of politicians of the past in a way.
Yeah, well, that's a good way of putting it. Yeah, I suppose that's true. Yeah, you mean self-appointed politicians of the past? Yeah, I mean, I don't think we should set ourselves up as being the prime arbiters, but we are experts, and expertise is something which seems to be decreasingly valued within society just now. So there's an element where we have society has archaeologists because they are viewed as being experts. So therefore, our opinion should count and should matter. But at the same time, that expertise can become eroded if we try and pretend that we are saying stuff about the past that we're not. We are not giving people the truth about the past. We're giving them a very well-informed, strongly argued version of the past. So I think that we also have to be honest about the nature of what we say about the past in order to critique what other people say about the past. So
there has been that sort of mistrust of experts now, isn't there? Like, people don't want to be told what they should think and how they should feel.
Yeah.
Which is quite interesting, because I guess it's interesting what you're saying, that you're sort of not like inert mediums, like you know, that the you know, your personality and your sensibilities and your creativity comes into this, you know, your findings and research and things. And talking about experts, I mean, that leads quite nicely onto you've been quite outspoken about the BBC Orkney program, which I watched, which me and my girlfriend watched avidly. With
I'm sure you enjoyed it. There's lots of great stuff.
Enjoyed it, yeah. I mean, it sort of felt slightly like sensationalist TV, and they had like sort of the adventure guy that was just climbing up stuff, but didn't really offer much else.
Yeah, he built a terrible sweat lodge that fell over.
Nearly badly injured someone inside.
It wasn't very clever.
And then obviously Chris Packham just doing his voice.
But actually, Chris Packham was interesting because he was a sort of voice of reason in the programme. Because there was a few times when there was a narrative developed which he actually questioned and said, actually, because I think that there was a lot of stuff talk about the Orkney Vole, which is quite a celebrated creature within Neolithic studies, because how did it get to Orkney? It must have got there on the boat of people who came from France with Neolithic stuff, and that's how the first farmers got to Orkney. And there's archaeologists who've published on that narrative. There are other archaeologists who think there are other ways to explain it. But Neil Oliver was banging on about this vole, and Chris Packham went to see it and he liked the vole and everything. But Chris Packham was saying, you know, surely there's all sorts of different ways this could have happened. It isn't necessarily just about people arriving in Orkney in a boat with voles from France. So he struck me as being a voice of reason. He was quite sensible, you know, in terms of he wasn't always just accepting the archaeological narrative, which is interesting because he was the one in the team who didn't really have an historical or an archaeological background. So he was very enthusiastic about animals and stuff like that as well. But I thought he was a voice of reason at times. Maybe just because he was coming from a point of view saying, well, that doesn't. How can you be so sure? And I think the program actually is a good example of what we're talking about, because it sets up a narrative which appears to be authoritative. And in fact, when the BBC responded to my critique, the producer of the programme said that basically what they were trying to do in the programme was to test a hypothesis and come to a conclusion. And as far as I was concerned, you know, it seemed to me that they decided before they started what the conclusion was going to be of that, and therefore the whole programme was set up to prove this theory they had, or these various different theories. But the programme had this sense of authority. So what concerned me about it was that, at a very basic level, was that if you get 3 hours of primetime television, it keeps banging on about the same idea again and again and again, and then backs up with some well-known TV presenters, some maps, and the maps incidentally were all just fictions that they created for the programme, and various other the tools of science, the tools of authority. And then he had Mike Parker Pearson on, who's a well-known archaeologist and authority in Stonehenge, who mentioned a few things about, again, which backed up their ideas. So everything about the programme was designed to give the impression that this was a completely authoritative mainstream view of the role of Orkney in the Neolithic and the way that the Neolithic stuff moved around Britain. And in fact, what they were representing was a minority opinion that very few people would accept in the way they expressed it. Very few archaeologists. So all I really wanted was a bit of balance, you know, in the sense that there has to be other voices that say it's not this simple. Here's another way it could have been. Here's some evidence that contradicts that, and then assume that the public are actually intelligent enough to take on board more than one idea at the same time, or at least accept that there are two different ways to understand the situation as the evidence suggests. So I think the programme was set up as an authoritative, expert-driven programme. And in fact, and to an extent, it wasn't. You know, so it was quite misleading. So I'm not saying it's not part of the post-truth narrative, because the idea they were testing out is a legitimate idea to think about, but the way it was expressed was quite sensationalist, and I think a lot of people would have been persuaded by it because there was no counter arguments and no counter evidence to suggest anything different. But you can also argue, well, so what? Because people sat and watched 3 hours of TV about the Neolithic, and when does that ever happen? So it's a balance, because I'm all for Neolithic stuff in the telly, but I just wish it wasn't always Stonehenge and Orkney, which it always seems to be. So
it seems to be hinged quite a lot on carbon dating certain element from the site, wasn't it? And if that didn't match, then the whole theory fell apart.
Yeah,
didn't it?
but that's what because that's not how archaeology generally works. And if you pin everything on a radiocarbon date, then you're in trouble. And I've had many radiocarbon dates that have been disappointing because they come out wrong, but actually they're not wrong. They're right, but they just don't fit your big theory you've got in your head. So yeah, there was a few moments like that which had a bit of peril, like getting phoned up with radiocarbon dates and I think the Neil Oliver seemed to know radiocarbon dates before the site director, which I thought was really bizarre. If I was the site director, I would never have allowed that to happen. So, but I suspect that probably it was just the way it was edited and put together for the programme. Because Nick Card, who directs Nessa Brodgar, has done an amazing job. It's an incredible site. He's a great archaeologist, but he actually, he did in the programme, he just talked about Nessa Brodgar. He was never involved in pushing the wider Orkney capital narrative. His agenda was to show people the Nessa Brodgar, which is an incredible site, and that broader stuff was tacked on. And if they'd done 3 hours on the Nessa Brodgar, that would have been fine, because it's one of the most important archaeological sites in the world, and it's still not known as well as it should be. But I think that they had to find this sensationalist narrative, I guess, to follow through, which is TV, I suppose.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sort of fascinated by the sites on Orkney anyway. I mean, I'd really like to get out there and have a look.
You should, yeah. It's fantastic.
Not had a chance.
It's
yet.
great. It's incredible.
So you got a stone carved ball.
Yeah.
Behind you.
Yeah. It's a fake one, but
did it?
I don't know. Where a colleague gave it to me. I think it's from a museum display because it's got a hole in the bottom.
Oh, is it plastic?
It must have been. No, it's a kind of resin, sort of heavy resin.
Oh,
it must have been stuck on a plinth or something like that. So my colleague's has got a museum background, so I don't know whether she got it from an old museum display or something like that. They're a good example of an object that we've no idea what it is at all. And archaeologists have been looking at these things for 150 years, and we've no idea what they are, and we probably never will.
I think that's what interests me so much about them. When I first learnt about them, they're just an object of pure interpretation.
Yeah, they are. Yeah. There's nothing. You can measure the dimensions to your blue in the face, and it won't tell you anything because people have tried to do that and said, oh, they're all different variations of an inch in diameter, or there's a whole typology based on the number of knobs. I mean, it's just ludicrous, but it's ultimately, who knows, what they were used for, but and they're very tactile objects. They stay in the hand very well. Is that enough? Was that what they were for, or did they have some meaning? And we don't know, and we can't tell, and it's difficult to prove or disprove any of the theories unless they're completely ludicrous. So it's a good example of the problems and the challenges and the excitement of studying prehistory, because if you sit down and think for a few days, I'm just going to spend some time with these objects, I'm going to immerse myself in them, and then you can come up with some really interesting ideas. They may or may not be relevant or useful, but it's quite good fun, So and it's legitimate to do that as well.
And in that sense, I mean, if there is no evidence and it's difficult to place them, then do they sort of become timeless objects in a way?
Yeah.
They could be, they exist in the present, and they existed back in the past, and they exist away into the future. So they sort of they will be however you interpret them at the time.
That's a really good way of putting it. Yeah, they are. I mean, they are. It's like there's an old phrase that every age gets the Stonehenge it deserves, and I think every age gets the carved stone balls it deserve, because everyone has got a different interpretation, and that changes through time, and it's mediated by social context, by the archaeological fashions of the day, by any technology that might come along to help you analyse things in a different way. So they'll just keep on changing through time and mutating into different things, and theories will change. And actually, what's quite intriguing, what you say, is that it may have been that in the Neolithic they were also viewed as timeless objects as well, because there's no reason to, for instance, for us to assume that in the Neolithic people imagined everything was created by other people. So it may be that these are objects that almost kind of emerged pre-existing. They were made by ancestors who are mythical characters. They've always been around. They've always been in the family. We don't really know where they came from. They were produced from the earth. You crack open a stone and one's there. It's just born or something. So we have to be careful not to necessarily think that our narratives would even make any sense in prehistory. And it may be someone in 3000 BC would look at one of those things and think it had been there forever, and right distant into the ancient past, or it was so these are objects that are potentially infinite. which is a really nice way of thinking about it. And I don't think that process actually hasn't really been explored by archaeologists, that kind of idea of timeless objects, so I might steal that idea.
Go for it. It's interesting how you're talking about your practices as an archaeologist compared to other archaeologists' practices, and psychogeography, for me, like reading works from psychogeographists.
Geographers. I think geographers.
Geographers.
Maybe yes. I don't know. Ologists.
Yeah, geographers. Yeah.
Yeah. Something. Like
you know, it is. I guess that history is given a context by the meaning you put onto it. So, I mean, in a way, like saying using Stonecrop as an example, maybe they were. I guess what I'm trying to say is. Archaeologists are desperately trying to put meaning on things. Like this served a purpose, it had a role.
Yes, yeah.
There was an element to this, even if it was like, you know, cultural items and religious or whatever. Like maybe some things just had no meaning to them. Maybe they were just sort of intuitive things that were created without having any context to them.
Yeah, I think that goes back to again that it's more or less impossible for us to really get into the heads of people in prehistory and how they viewed things and how they viewed the world around them and how they viewed objects and people and animals and buildings and structures, because all we can do is think about these in our own terms. So therefore, you know, to us, everything has to have a meaning or a value, and I guess we can't assume that necessarily was the case in the past. And it may well be that carved stone balls were objects that people didn't understand in prehistory, and even if they had a motivation and a meaning and were understandable in the Neolithic, presumably people found these things in the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, you know, and in the medieval period. You know, what did they think about them? How did they understand these objects? They were objects that were completely alien to them, and they would have to understand them within their own context. So in a sense, the past is almost like a kind of a blank slate, almost, that a blank canvas that we can start to add our own detail to, and it's always going to be in our own image. You know, that's the thing. It's difficult to escape the fact that regardless of how crazy and weird and strange stuff is that happened in the Neolithic, we have to try and explain it in terms that make sense to us. And it may sometimes, you know, people say to me, wouldn't it be good if you could get a time machine and go back in the past, go back and watch them building stone circles or whatever? And it would be useful in some respects because it would give you a better idea of technical processes, but it still wouldn't help you understand why people were doing things, because you couldn't communicate with them. Even if you could communicate with them, it may not be understandable what they're doing, what they're talking about, what their motivations are. They may be using concepts that make no sense to us in a kind of Western 21st century situation. Anthropologists spend years embedded within communities around the world and still don't really understand everything. There's still some secrets they're not allowed access to because they're not part of that culture. And so as archaeologists, we're further removed from the object of our study. So I think that I think that is one of the problems we have is to try and understand weird and alien stuff within familiar terminology and concepts. We can only use our words to describe what was going on in the past in situations that might make absolutely no sense, literally no sense to us, because it's very alien. Some things will make sense to us, of course, you know, because they're quite human things like eating and drinking, and some other things might just make sense because, well, okay, they put the standing stone up so that the crops don't fail, so that's fine, we can understand that as a concept. But there may also be other reasons why they do stuff that will just go, what? That doesn't make any sense. There's no logic to that at all. There's no words to describe that. So I think that's a challenge of prehistory in particular, but of any archaeology, of trying to transcend cultural and vocabulary limitations, of trying to make sense of deeply different and weird societies and cultures, and that's why everything has to be given a carved stone ball is what we call that, because that's what it means. That's what it looks like to us. You know, that name is a deeply kind of descriptive name for an object that we can't make any sense of. So, but that's also why some things like Cursus monuments are interesting, because Cursus monuments make you sit up and take notice, because most people say, what does that mean? That's not a familiar word or a concept. And actually, maybe if we called more of our prehistoric stuff weird names that don't make any sense, if we just made up new words for them, that might actually get people to start to think about the difference of the past and engage with it a bit more, which is something else I might go away and think about and start to rename familiar things with weird made-up words and names.
Like, yeah, there's a few points there. Stone-carved port. I always quite like the name of it because it is descriptive.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
So it's not an unfamiliar thing. So
Yeah.
it's almost like when they acquired the name, it was probably just because no one had thought of giving it a name.
Yeah,
So
well, it's a thing
it's
a thing that wouldn't have had a name within modern culture, modern society. So then, they would have had to come up with something. So it's probably lucky they did come up with Carstone Balls and not some ludicrous Latin kind of variant of something or whatever. But yeah, it is a good name.
And that's really interesting how you talk about. We wouldn't necessarily even if a time machine wouldn't necessarily be able to interpret the meaning behind people's actions. Then I guess has some relevance today. Maybe a good point on that was there was a film made a few years ago about a nuclear waste facility dump that they were building in, I think it's Sweden or Finland. Sweden, I think. There's a whole part of the film where they talk about language, and it's like, how do you warn civilizations of the future not to dig here, not to go here? And it's like you have to think outside your restraints of what you consider language to be, because like how people will interpret communication in the future will be entirely different to how we communicate now.
Because I think I heard someone talk about this once. We've got a guy who was a former master's student who ended up in working in physics, and he talked about this a bit because he was talking about the future archaeology of radioactive dumps, and how might archaeologists have a part to play in thinking about how to manage those into the future, because archaeologists are used to digging down and finding stuff and then having to deal with it. But he was talking about the fact, that there's a universal symbol for radioactivity and danger and all these things, but we can't assume that in 1,000 years that people will come down and they'll say, oh, we can't go near this, we can't touch this, we can't try and open this up. So it's a bit like the kind of Quatermass thing, where it's at some point you find something and you don't really understand what it is, and there's either symbols or there's something weird about it, or it's a material you don't understand, but you might as well crack it open and see what's there, which is then ensues in disaster. So how do you actually stop that from happening? And archaeologists might have a part to play in that process in terms of thinking about, well, what are the kinds of things as archaeologists that we would be looking out for as danger signs, when we're digging something about contamination or disease, or places that we should stop working at and take stock and things like that. So there's a dimension about that when you're trying to hide something and bury it. How do you transmit that? And prehistory is a lesson that it doesn't take long for stuff to be completely forgotten, and it's not to have a clue about what it is. So this, and even you find stuff in the archaeological record from a few hundred years ago and it just doesn't make any sense, and you think, well, what's that? Why has that happened? What's going on there? And you can do a bit of guesswork, but it doesn't take long for stuff to be forgotten, and we shouldn't necessarily assume that because we have digital means of recording stuff just now, that in 100 years' time or 500 years' time that stuff will make any sense to anyone, because I think that the world is an unstable future, and our technology is potentially unstable as well. No one really knows. I mean, I don't know. I'm not an expert, of course, but I can kind of imagine a future quite easily where suddenly everything becomes obsolete so quickly. I mean, my PhD's on a floppy disk. It's like, so what do I do with that? So thankfully someone scanned it as a PDF, but it's just so. But when I did that 20 odd years ago, I didn't really think about the fact that will become obsolete within 10 years, and it would just become like a museum piece. So I think that archaeology it has a lesson, the fact that it's very easy for people in society to forget things and to forget the meanings of even quite simple and basic things, and we shouldn't make any assumptions about the future.
You're saying that the future is unstable. Would you consider the past to be unstable too?
Well, the future of the future of the past is unstable. Yeah, the past is inherently unstable, because the past to us is material, because it's the remnants of the past that survive in the present, which is inherently unstable in a whole range of different reasons. What we'd call the archaeological record, which is actually just the remnants of everything that people do in a very broad level, is subject to erosion, change, damage, continued accumulation. It's completely unstable, and we don't have any real sense of the scale of it either, of what's out there and what we've found, what we haven't found. It's all that known and unknown stuff. We don't know what's out there. We don't know what we don't know what we don't know about the past. So it's completely, the past completely unstable. And as archaeologists, in a sense, a lot of what we do is firefighting. It's just trying to opportunistically find stuff where we can, which is usually nowadays because of development, because of someone wants to build a road somewhere. So archaeologists respond, we go and dig where the road's going to go, and then we find something that we otherwise would never have found. So the best thing that ever happened for Neolithic studies in Ireland was a motorway building programme in the 1990s, because they went from having 10 Neolithic houses to 80 in the space of a decade. Because they were building roads in places that archaeologists didn't know there was anything there. They hadn't had any evidence there was anything there. We can't afford to just randomly dig all over the place. But as soon as you start to cut swathes through the landscape, you just find stuff. So actually, so things like major development programs and the needs of, this is going to a completely different topic now, but the kind of the infrastructure needs of society today and into the future is actually what's shaping the growth of the archaeological record, which is really, I think, is really interesting. And it's not our agenda anymore, because it's very difficult to get money to do a research excavation. If I want to dig something just for research purposes, it's tough to get any money nowadays. But if someone's doing a major development, they have legally have to pay an archaeologist or archaeologists to deal with the consequences of that. So that's where stuff's being found. That's where most of the great discoveries are happening now. It's completely by chance, except in places like Stonehenge and Orkney, where there's always an appetite to fund research excavations because of the traditional dominant position they have within British archaeology. But for the most part, the agenda, where we dig, where we look, what we find is being shaped by the wider needs of society. Crossrail in London is finding massive amounts of archaeological sites, huge amounts of information, really exciting. When would an archaeologist ever have the chance to have a cross section through the kind of the subterranean London? Never. It could never happen. If the high speed railway line ever happens, you can guarantee there'll be tons of archaeology found as well. Again, not necessarily in our terms, but we will reap the benefits in terms of information and data and stuff we can do. So I think the whole nature of the discipline into the future is changed, so the past is unstable and so is the future, and it's not really in the hands of archaeologists. So we have to be very reactive, to make sure that we can, I guess, be opportunistic and take advantage of opportunities, but not just to find stuff about the past for the past's sake. That's the key thing going forward. But certainly before the 1980s, most development projects were destroying archaeology, and it just was swept away and nothing happened. I mean, the situation in Ireland is interesting, because in Ireland the motorway upgrade programme really was the biggest thing that had happened in road building in Ireland, whereas all of the major motorway construction in Britain happened in the 60s and the 70s, when there was a much poorer understanding of the nature of rescue and salvage archaeology. So I'm guessing that massive amounts of stuff's been swept away, been covered by urbanisation, before archaeologists even got a handle on what was happening. So I think that a lot of the opportunities have gone, a lot of the stuff's already gone, or else it's been covered over, or it's been destroyed. So in the past it was quite piecemeal. Now it's more formal. So you do get the process where archaeologists are working hand in hand with developers, and in some cases, commercial archaeology units basically they competitively tender for this work, and they explicitly say on their websites, we will smooth your development, we will facilitate your development, we will get the archaeology out the way as quick as possible and let you get on with things and do it cheap. And that's the nature of the industry now for the most part.
Wow. Didn't know that. That's pretty incredible.
Yeah, it is. Oh, yeah, because it's a competitive industry, which goes back to the 1980s when competitive tendering was brought in. So it was the Thatcherism is what shaped modern archaeology, definitely in Britain.
Okay, that's interesting. Can you expand on that?
Well, the nature of the principle that the developer pays is a really important one. The developer has to pay for cleaning up the archaeology, and that principle was brought in order to stop the state having to deal with it, in which they did in various different, slightly disorganised ways through government agencies. Like Historic Scotland had their own excavation unit once that carried out big digs in the 70s and 80s, but very expensive excavations. So that burden was passed over to developers in the private sector. But in order to do that, then it meant that there had to be a process of competitive tendering, so that different options were available for businesses, and so archaeological commercial firms emerged in the 80s. And essentially ever since then, it's just been a highly competitive market where there's lots of people whose jobs depend on businesses getting the archaeological contracts to do big development projects, and it's so the number of archaeologists working in Britain is directly related to the state of the economy. So in 2008, overnight, hundreds if not thousands of archaeologists lost their jobs in the financial crash because development stopped. Therefore, there was no need for as many archaeologists. So the commercial units have grown up, and you've got this situation where the economy booms, archaeology booms, the economy is weak, and archaeologists lose their job. And most archaeologists lots of archaeologists work on 0-hour contracts, poor short-term contracts. They don't get paid very well. So most people work in the discipline don't have a great time of it. It's quite unpredictable. So again, it's the unpredictability of the nature of archaeology, but there's also this other, wild card thing of, if people aren't building houses, then there's no place, no sites to go and do watching briefs on, so there's fewer archaeologists. So there's been a process of that, and also there's been a process of tendering becoming increasingly like a race to the bottom, where jobs are done more and more cheaply just to try and get the contracts, and then it's just so it's not always that satisfactory. But the other side of that is, in the last decade, there's been a change in emphasis of these kind of projects that have become more and more related to wider social benefit, and so it's part of the kind of broader move towards everyone in the public sector, and to an extent the private sector, becoming more transparent, and archaeologists increasingly have to justify their existence by having kind of community elements to projects, having schools coming, visiting sites, trying to think of ways to use the archaeology for education, to increase tourism, to try and help inform people about where they live, and all these kind of things. So there's increasingly archaeologists are able to not just get money from developers to do the basic archaeological work, but also to squeeze out a bit of extra money to do other kind of community related work on top of that as well. So that's been a major change in the last kind of 5 to 10 years, which is something we are trying to emphasise to our students, is that it's not just enough as an archaeologist now to know how to hold a trowel. That will take you so far in the business, but actually in the heritage sector now you have to think about creativity, imagination, ways of involving kids, ways of communicating with the public, and all that kind of stuff. So it's starting to change now. So it's still quite a highly commercial environment for most archaeologists, but there's also a bit of room for manoeuvre for doing some more interesting stuff. So the situation's improving, I think.
We're sort of saying that now archaeology, which fundamentally is sort of like looking at the past, is symbolically now associated with progress and development for the future.
Mm-hmm.
I mean that, and I guess there's that's quite interesting, because between those two indefinite times, in a way, that's the meeting of those two things. Is sort of what's the definition of the present, and it's quite interesting in reference to the Cocknow stone, in how that was uncovered and it's been covered back up again.
Yes.
I mean,
it's
I don't know if those two things necessarily, the 2 points I just made there, link, but
it's a kind of crazy story, really. But there's the key thing about the Cocknow stone is that it's a significant archaeological site, and it's in a really interesting location because it's next to a really big population. Most rock art sites are out in Argyll or in Northumberland or something, and they're out in the countryside and rural areas. So this is a site that's got potential for lots of visitors. It's got potential as an education resource because of that. There's a primary school that's 5 minutes walk away from it and that kind of thing. So it's got a future orientated potential, because you could imagine a site that could essentially be put to work for the local community and the benefit of local people, whereas currently that can't happen because it's buried. And we buried it again because we had to, because we wouldn't have been allowed to uncover it to gather the data we did unless we said we were going to bury it again. So it kind of encapsulates really what I'm interested in, which is trying to unlock prehistoric sites that are less valued by archaeologists, or are viewed as being problematic or difficult or rubbish or buried or hidden in some different way, or just ruinous and a kind of past their best. It's trying to unlock the potential of those places to be beneficial to the people who live around or nearby. So if you could create a replica of the Cocknell stone, for instance, which is what we're trying to raise money to do, and then put it in the location, and then the council puts in a new car park, and then 10,000 people a year come to visit it as a kind of a heritage tourist attraction. That's like 10,000 more people that would ever go there normally, because there's a park there that's used by a few local dog walkers, and that's it. If you then make it part of a broader rock art walking trail, because there's about 17 bits of rock art in the location, then you can hopefully get local people to go out and walk around the countryside and get a bit of exercise and experience that. People will come from elsewhere to do the walks. There's the simple things you can do that will help improve people's lives in various different ways, and potentially maybe create little bits of economic boosts as well, depending on other circumstances as well. And there's grander things you could do as well, with like a visitor centre or something like that, or whatever. But those are all kind of well in the future. But I think what's really exciting about it is you're going to a place that society doesn't value, which is Faithfully and Hardgate in Western Bartonshire, places that have got low life expectancy, drug problems, high rates of unemployment, all those kind of things that you can associate with those kind of areas. A place that society doesn't value, that people don't necessarily want to go to, and the people who live there are well aware of the way that their estate is viewed by the outside world. I mean, the Daily Mail, when they very briefly covered the Cocknell Stone, said something about this grotty housing estate, and that's how they described it. And when they were talking about the discovery of the stone being uncovered, which they later removed that word from their website, but they had that in for a few weeks. So there's this sense of judgment being placed on these people, but then these people have got something in their midst which is amazing, which is 5,000 years old potentially, which is possibly one of the most spectacular bits of rock art in Northern Europe, which is something which is known about by archaeologists that live in other parts of Europe. It's mentioned in the literature. And these are things that are actually really valuable for people to know about where they live. And I think this is where it comes back to this idea of deep time, because if you can say to people, actually, where you live is somewhere that 5,000 years ago was an incredibly significant place. People would come here with their animals, people would come here, they would live in the vicinity, they would be carving these amazing rock symbols into these giant rocks in the landscape. This was like a kind of a magical, sacred place. That's actually really powerful, I think, and people can start to rethink where they live and rethink about the potential and the possibilities. And actually, heritage can promote a sense of pride in place, and can actually make people feel better about where they live. And so if we can promote that, and we can tap into that, and we can really engage with the community, and really kind of, not everyone's going to be interested or want to hear about it, but a lot of people will be genuinely blown away by it. Their minds will be blown, and I think that having taken the school kids I went up there with, it was incredible, because these school kids, some of whom their parents or their grandparents remembered the stone before it was buried in 1965, and they used to go and play on it when they were kids. And so that connection was amazing, and these kids were realised how fantastic it was to see this stone that no one had seen before, or their big brothers and sisters hadn't seen before. And those little things just give you a sense of how powerful prehistory can be in the right location, when essentially people suddenly get this realisation that where they live is somewhere that people have done something really amazing thousands and thousands of years ago. And that juxtaposition is really the power of prehistory. That's where you can say to people, there's deep time here, there's something really special here. Where you live is a really special place. You just don't know it, or it's been hidden from you, in this case by the authorities who buried it, and the landowners who didn't want people to have access to it, and people were disenfranchised from that knowledge and that information. So if you can unlock that as an archaeologist, or anyone else, an artist, whoever else comes along and can unlock that potential, then you can do amazing things with archaeology that's otherwise forgotten or viewed as being unimportant. So I think that's I don't think that relates to the question you asked me, to be honest with you, but I think that's really powerful. And that's the kind of things I'm trying to explore, the power of prehistoric sites to help make a difference in people's lives in a little or a big way, depending on what we can do. So that's my objective in the years going forward.
Okay, that's interesting. I mean, that's something I was going to ask you about. But maybe that goes back to the point where, like when we sort of talk about how you interpret the past, like maybe that's why Neolithic era is so interesting to people, or prehistory is so interesting, is because you can personalise it in a way, and you can make it how you want. I mean, and in a way, it's liberating
Yes, yeah, that's exactly right, and exactly the thing about rock art in particular, is that you can, or it's the same as carved stone balls. Rock art. Archaeologists have been studying rock art for 200 years. We don't have a clue what it means. We don't know what any of the symbols mean. We'll never know what they mean. It's impossible to get to the truth of it all. But what you can do is you can go and say to groups of school kids or to local people, your guess is as good as mine. What do you think they look like? What do you think these concentric circles are for? Why do you think people are scraping these marks in the rock? And kids are really empowered by that, because then they sort of think, all right, okay, so I've got this idea. What do you think? And you can say, well, that's interesting, and I haven't heard that before, or oh yeah, an archaeologist wrote that once, and you can open up really interesting conversations, and it is liberating, because I'm not going in as an expert with all the answers and saying, right, this is what you've got here, and this is what it was used for in the past, and all that kind of stuff, and that's the situation, and I hope you find that interesting. I'm going in and saying, I'm going to tell you about something amazing that's in where you live, but then I want you to help me make sense of it, because I don't know what it means, and that's a really great way to kind of open a conversation with local people. And so it goes back to what we talked about earlier on, about the balance between being an expert but not also being the voice of authority, because people do value experts. When you talk to them on a one-to-one level, people still value the expertise of an archaeologist. They still want to know, what do you think? How do you know that site's there? They still value our techniques and the stuff that we do. But what it's about, using your expertise to help them and to try and mediate them through whatever that process is, and depending what you do with the archaeological site and what the outcomes are. But it's also about trying to empower them as well, I guess, which is a cheesy way to say it, really. But by saying to people, what do you think? Help me make sense of it. I think that's really great, and you can say the same about stone circles, standing stones, earthworks, pits with stuff in them. You can just say to them, well, here's a few things archaeologists have. What do you think? There's a housing estate in Fife, in Glenrothes, where there's a prehistoric enclosure inside a housing estate. And when it was excavated in the 70s, they found a burial in the centre of the monument that had a teenage boy with a kind of a handled pottery beaker in the burial, and a kind of pendant. And that you can then just start to say to people, what do you think that's about? Why do you think this? Why do you think the only burial inside this important enclosure is this teenage boy? Who was this person? Why were they buried with these objects? And you can start to open up conversations that are based on archaeological evidence, but don't necessarily have any factual outcome at the end of it, but it's got lots of interpretations. So the prehistory lends itself, you're absolutely right, prehistory lends itself especially well to allowing everyone to have an opinion. And if you provide them with the evidence and the tools and the data and the framework for them to have that an informed opinion, then it can lead to really exciting places. An archaeologist, at the end of the day, I can't prove them wrong, which they quite like. I can't, unless they say stuff about aliens and stuff, and even then I can't prove them wrong, really. But you can start. There's stuff you can have a conversations about it, but for the most part, you can say you can have conversations, and you can come away and hopefully whoever you're talking to will think, well, actually, my opinion was listened to, it counted, it mattered, and maybe there's something you can do with that in terms of how you actually promote the site in the future, or literature associated with it, or notice boards, or websites, or apps, or whatever it is. It's not just your expert opinion, it's about what local people think as well, which is really important.
It's interesting. I mean, I think, again, maybe my interest lies with prehistory because of its relationship to art, in that a lot of art is inconclusive.
Yes.
It is what you make of it, and the narratives that you derive from it.
Although if a student handed in a dissertation that didn't have a conclusion, I wouldn't be happy. So there's a time and a place.
It's a different kind of conclusion.
It is, exactly.
It's
a conclusion suggests, if you're looking at like a piece of art, or if you're looking at a stone circle, a conclusion suggests that there's an end to the process, that there's an end to the interpretive process, and that you've shut down discussion and said that's it. This is the final word, and there cannot be a final word with a prehistoric site like a stone circle. There will never be a final word. There will never be a point where we can say conversation's over, we've cracked it, we've solved that problem. It's an unsolvable problem. So in a sense, it's a gift that keeps giving, because you can, because you're going to continue to have the refreshed conversation. You said earlier on, these things are timeless, and these are timeless sites with really endless potential to be utilised, to help people, or to educate people, or to empower people, or whatever, to make them feel good about where they live. So it's about trying to tap into that and to make it happen, and that's the and that's a key thing. It's about identifying where the key sites are that will work and that have that potential. But more or less anything prehistoric can work well in that context if you can actually just explain to people what was found. Because most archaeology is difficult to get access to, even though there's a national database of stuff. You still have to really have an understanding of expert jargon to navigate your way through what a henge is, or what's a food vessel, or all the, there's still stuff that's opaque, so we have to find better ways to communicate the nature of archaeological sites that are near where people live. And probably the official channels that we have for doing that just now don't really work very effectively.